Hello everyone, welcome back to our course, Foreign Language Teaching Methodology. It's part of the Southeast European University's online master's course in English language teaching. Today's module is concerned with the history of English language teaching, a brief overview. It's brief, but as you know, the history of language teaching is long, so it's not that brief. There's a lot of things to cover, and we'll move fairly quickly. And I'll try to point out some of the areas, some of the tendencies and trends which have influenced the way language is taught, particularly the English language, since that is our subject. I thought I'd begin with a quote. This is from Howat in his book, The History of English Language Teaching. The history of language teaching, English included, reveals itself in a pattern of contrast that have been repeated many times in different ways over the course of time. The basic distinction is one between the perception of a language as a set of representative texts on the one hand, and as a mental system creating new texts on the other. From a pedagogical point of view, the parallel contrast between deductive and inductive methodology is essentially a comparable question. In recent times, however, the significance of text has become inflated in certain contexts, and languages are often characterized in terms of an arbitrary subset of these texts, English being, for instance, the language of science, Shakespeare, colonialism, popular entertainment. We need to remember that English is a system for making meaning, not merely for communicating it. Now, this quotation, I think, is a very interesting one to consider, and it's one that is worth reading several times in order to get the essence. I'll point out a couple things about it, though, before we move on. In particular, I'd like to mention the idea of representative text and mental system, okay? A text being something you can see, something you can read, and a mental system is something you have for creation of meaning. Okay, so is the focus on being able to access information, or is the focus on being able to create information, be able to create meaning? Another thing I want to point out is this idea of deductive and inductive methodology. For those of you not familiar with these terms, they're ones you should become familiar with, because we'll come back to them not only in this presentation, but in future discussions of how to teach and how to learn. But basically, just in a nutshell, deductive teaching, deductive learning is a system where you start with, for example, a rule. You're taught the rule, a grammar rule, for instance, and then after learning about the rule, you apply it. Okay, so it's deductive. Inductive is that backwards. In inductive methodology, inductive learning, inductive teaching, you start with trying to sort of figure out the rule, okay? And then you might learn the rule later. Now, if you think about the way we learned our first language, your L1, you learned it inductively. Perhaps you learned a second language in a combination of deductive and inductive, okay? I think it's never one or the other. I think anyone who's gone to school has had both deductive and inductive learning experiences, and teachers use both at different times. But it's an interesting distinction, isn't it? Because if you think about the fact that our students need to learn the rules, and if we teach them the rules, they know the rule in isolation. But if you want them to be able to understand the rule in context, is it better to first teach the rule and then put the rule into context? Or is it better to understand the context and then figure the rule out? Is it better to learn the way we learn our first language, through figuring things out? Or is it better to learn the way that often we learn the second, which is to apply a set of rules to new situations? It's an important question to keep in mind. We'll start back in the 1400s in England with what's called the grammar school. The grammar school was a dominant form of education for children. It started with boys only, no girls at school, aged 8. And what they did with language, they learned Latin. And they learned Latin rules and definitions. Now, you recall that Latin, even though it was a big language at the time, it was very much used in society to read, and it was used in laws, it was used in the church, it was used in universities almost exclusively. It was a dead language. It wasn't a living language. It was a language that the speakers were long gone. And though it existed in text, it didn't exist in conversation. So it wasn't a language there was no innovation. And when new things came along, Latin often wasn't there to describe them because, for example, the vocabulary didn't exist, and you can't make up new words for Latin. The language is closed, a closed system. The focus was on learning the rules and definitions of that system. And the major methodology was, the technique for learning was rote. In other words, learning through memorization, learning through repetition. Repeat after me, and repeat again until you get it right. And if you don't get it right, then you're punished. So corporal punishment was the method for enforcing learning. And corporal punishment is beating, essentially. It's hitting. If you got the wrong answer, perhaps you would get slapped on the hand or something like that with a stick, or otherwise abused somehow physically, until you got it right. Now, there wasn't all that way. I mean, there were some exceptions, and one of the major exceptions was this man Comenius. And Comenius' focus was more on the spiritual development of children, and he believed in the primacy of nature and experience. And so he thought that the way that you learn was through association with the world around you. Seems very basic to us now, but something then which is considered a bit revolutionary. And here's an example of what Comenius did. There's two separate pictures here, and one is used to describe the sound, ah, and you can see it's written in 4 different languages. English is the third, the crow caws. And you have a picture of a crow. Now, so there you have the picture to associate with the sound. Now again, this is something rather revolutionary, though today it would seem quite commonplace. But in 1658, this was something new. And below you have another picture. Again, it's an association between a picture, not in a sound this time, but a picture and a word. So if you read the text and you don't understand it, many of the words have numbered references. And you can look at the picture, and you can see you can associate the image with the word, therefore, to get the meaning, without using translation. Reinforced learning through visual representation, which is what we do now. Now, the way this was received was, as far as I know, in my my limited knowledge, was that it was considered to be rather silly, childish, and definitely not for the elite, something that the working class might have access to, but it wasn't the way that people were supposed to go to school and learn. So, we moved on, the grammar schools continued. Other things, of course, happened. And the major events of the 17th century in England, the major event was the Revolution and the Restitution, Oliver Cromwell's revolution to overthrow the monarchy, and then not long after, the restitution of the monarchy. So Cromwell overthrew Charles I, and then Charles II came back and took the throne. But Cromwell's revolution was a revolution of the people. And so it was also something driven by the realization the monarchy was out of touch. One of the things that was happening at this time was the rise of science. And through science, you have questions about the church, because science often seems to be in opposition to the church throughout history. And those of you who have read history know that science is something the church has not often been rushing to embrace. And with the separation of church and state, as science becomes the means for political agenda, and the church continues to hold on to its dominion, with the influence of science, you have the need to describe the world in new ways. New things are being learned, and you need the vocabulary to describe it. And so suddenly, Latin, again, was limited. And some of these new theories and concepts needed to be described in the L1, in the mother tongue of the people who were describing them. So English became more important. And so the natural sciences and mathematics, the growth at this time, led to a need to focus not just on Latin in education, but also to focus on using English in education. A major change. Now, the British Empire was expanding, and as you look at the picture, you can imagine this is the world, and the expression "the sun never sets on the British Empire" was true. At any time during the 24-hour day and night, the sun was shining somewhere on the British Empire. It was a huge empire. Now, we talked in the last module about Phillipson's idea of linguistic imperialism. And as far as English is concerned, this was the genesis of that. You had the core, which was England, Britain here in the center, and the periphery, which are all the colonies. Now, this, of course, the immediate impact of the British Empire wasn't suddenly that everybody started speaking English in the world. That seems to be happening now, but it took a while to happen. And it wasn't the agenda of the British to spread their language, to spread their culture. Their agenda, of course, was political control for economic reasons, trade, and political domination. But through this domination, through the trade, you needed to have some kind of control over the areas which you have conquered. And obviously you have administrative units that move in, and you have a system put in place, and that system is based on the British standards and also using the English language. So you can see the English language and also the culture of the English language was spread around the world in that way.